it's me, Boulevard, your favorite Legends of Runeterra caster, here to take a look at patch 1.11 through the scope of a tournament lens. Now, the decks that have been performing very well over the course of the last patch are War Mothers, Targon Lee Sin, Noxus Bilgewater, which I just kind of lumped together because there's a fair amount of overlap between Noxus Nab, Pirate Aggro, and TF Swain, so we'll see if any of those got hit. Demacia Targon, this is mostly referring to Luxsoul and Leona Asel, which is basically Luxsoul, but they put in Mountain Scryer, so they're different decks. And then Shen Fiora. These have been sort of the top tournament decks for a little while, so when we're looking at patch notes, I think if you're trying to get hopeful for an esports scene, it's pretty important to know, do they look at tournament results? So we're really looking for nerfs to sort of these kinds of decks to see if they actually are paying attention to this. And, there's going to be overlap between ladders and tournaments, but these are sort of, as long as we see nerfs to these, we feel like we're in a good spot heading into an esports scene potentially in the future. We at least know that they're looking at tournaments and maybe doing some balance around that. So get started off with the Aurelian Soul, and I think this is actually going to make it really hard for Asel to level. There's, Ramp Soul is a popular tournament deck as well. And I feel like every time we see Asel level, like you're trying really hard to get right on that 20 mark. So upping it to 25, I think is actually going to have a really big impact. Like I don't think Lux Asel really exists anymore, especially with this Radiant Guardian nerf, her going down to a 4/5. The amount of times that you really need her to be trading with 5/5s, and we'll even see a little bit later on the Jack the Winner nerf, doesn't really mean much when the Radiant Guardian got a power nerf as well. So Jack can still take those trades and survive. And of course, now, the Radiant Guardian will still survive as well, but she always would have. So, yeah, it's a little bit awkward. I think that these two nerfs combined really take things like Luxsoul off the table, especially with how often we were seeing that exact 20 on the level up. I'm not super hopeful for the future of that regional combination. As for things like Ramp Soul, it's a little bit more awkward. There were a few times where you would see the Aurelian Soul come down and the only other unit on board would be like an Infinite Mind Splitter, and then it's like, okay, I just have to get down one rinky-dinky little guy and I can go ahead and level. There were a couple times where he'd come down alongside two Mind Splitters. Now you really are playing more for those double Mind Splitter turns, and overall, I kind of like leveling Asel a little bit later, just because there have been a lot of times where Asel comes down, he invokes the Living Legends, and then the game is basically over on the next turn because I play out like two cards, and then, oh look, not only do I have 13 mana left, but I also have 8 0-mana Celestials in my hand. So with the direction that Asel has kind of taken, just being this late game inevitable bomb, if you hit the Living Legends, then I don't really mind having him pushed back a little bit, because I think that unleveled Asel is still fine. Like, you still invoke a Celestial on play, you still get a random Celestial at the start of every turn, and overall I think that you're just going to have to play more games with an unleveled Asel and pillar on that, and I think that's totally reasonable. I don't think he's a bad card by any stretch of the imagination when he's unleveled, and I think that leveled was ending games a little bit too easily, I guess, especially like, if I throw down a Mind Splitter and an Asel, and I attack with both of them, and you're in a position where you have to block both of them, because they have Fury, all of a sudden I'm at 20 power. I think it was just a little bit too easy to do, so I'm actually pretty happy to see the Asel nerf. Radiant Guardian, we talked a lot about how Radiant Guardian, kind of carries Demacia decks, especially if you're not going for Bannerman. I was kind of hoping to see some Lux buffs to compensate for a Radiant Guardian nerf, just because we haven't seen Lux decks without Radiant Guardian in quite some time. Lux herself doesn't really feel like the win condition a lot of the times. We always joke about how Radiant Guardian feels like a champion, so I really don't think we're going to see Lux Soul anymore with these nerfs, especially because the deck was already kind of falling to the wayside. People had really kind of figured it out. It wasn't as well suited into the meta as it once was, and with things like War Mothers just completely skipping nerfs, I don't think Lux Soul is going to be the deck to play anytime soon or anymore, really. Even Leona Asel, it's sort of the same thing. Radiant Guardian was one of the cards that they kept in there, but yeah, I think this one's just about in the ground in terms of tournament play. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time talking about these two because we generally saw them come out of Petty Officer, which also received a nerf, but even if he didn't, I don't really like talking about the RNG potential of hitting one of these. Obviously, picks got a little bit better. I think Inspiring Mentor, probably about the same in terms of playability. Having a 2/1 in Ionia is actually really nice, so maybe this will see some kind of play, but Lulu was banned in a lot of tournaments for the first few weeks of Call of the Mountain because of a couple of bugged interactions with her, and a lot of people were telling me like, oh, it's just a Shen Lulu meta. Once Lulu gets off, then, it's just a Shen Lulu meta. And Lulu's been here for a couple of weeks and she has not done anything. I think that giving a little bit of buffs to her supporting power is really good, especially because I don't really like the idea that you're pigeonholed into playing Lulu and Demacia, especially since the War Chef nerf, and I think that was something that kind of hurt Lulu's playability even if she was a good deck, just generally you're pairing Lulu with Demacia. So when the War Chef nerf happened and it made the card a lot less enticing, the Lulu decks did take a hit, so maybe this will bump up the playability just a smidge. I don't really think I was playing either of these cards in the deck previously. I still don't think you're playing picks. Maybe you start to play Inspiring Mentor. We'll have to see on that one, but overall I think that it's really not doing a whole lot with these buffs. I had mentioned that I'm just lumping all the Noxus Bilgewater decks together, that's Pirate Aggro, Nab, and TF Swain, because they have a lot of overlap, and Jack the Winner and Petty Officer are sort of the two main offenders. Jack hasn't seen play in every TF Swain deck, it's still seeing play in about less than half of them in tournaments, but I'd made the call a while ago that I felt like the deck needed a little bit more meat in the middle, and it looks like players agreed with me, and they started, kind of putting Jack the Winner into that deck to take up the 5-drop slot. So let's talk about what this nerf actually means for him. Feels like Jack the Winner was sort of designed to be a 5/4 that dealt 2 damage when you play him. And then, he's obviously got the extra copies of Sleep with the Fishies as the game goes on, and you can throw them onto other units. But in Noxus Bilgewater decks, there's only so many units that you can play that on, and it'll actually survive. I think this impacts Pirate Aggro the most, just because, once you play the Sleep with the Fishes on Jack, as he is sort of the only unit in your deck that's going to survive that outside of Gangplank, then now he's susceptible to 3 damage removal like Grasp of the Undying and Noxian Fervor. Obviously, there were also the situations where your opponent plays a 5-mana 5/5, such as Radiant Guardian and Gangplank seemed like the most common, even Garen, and you could play Jack and just sort of totally stalwart their turn. They can no longer attack with that big unit, or the Jack survives. Even if they have to use another removal spell on them a little bit later on, your Jack at least got the 2-for-1 out. Things like TF Swain and Noxus Nab have a couple of 3/3s or just more keg generations, so they actually had better chances of using Sleep with the Fishes, but it definitely felt like Pirate Aggro was the deck where it was most important to actually resolve the Jack spell. So I think this actually hurts Pirate Aggro the most out of the 3 decks, which is fine. Pirate Aggro was very popular. Noxus Nab sort of the 3rd most popular of the 3, even though it's gaining traction. But TF Swain still isn't playing this card in even half of their decks, so I don't think any nerf that you did to this would impact that deck too much. But I do think that Jack was sitting just a little bit too strong. How many times have you sat down across from someone and they play a Jack the Winner and you're just like, okay, there goes, that's, at least 2 removal spells. It just didn't feel good. It was a little bit too much value for a 5-drop that threatened a little bit too much damage. That was just a little bit too easy to get off, especially in Nab, where you've got things like Petty Officer makes a keg. Okay, we'll throw it on the keg next turn. Oh, I Yordle Grifter. You know what? That can go ahead and go down to a 3/1. Same thing with Jagged Butcher and stuff like that. So I'm not upset at this nerf. That said, I don't think it really impacts the play rate of Noxus Bilgewater decks. I think that they'll still see a lot of play through the Jack nerf. The Petty Officer nerf, a little bit of a different story. So Petty Officer used to be a 3/1, then it became a 3/2, now it's back down to a 3/1. This feels really bad. Petty Officer was never played as a 3/1 unless you really needed additional keg generation. And, it's sort of one of those weird things where this card seemed really bad, it got a buff, okay, now this card's really good. When you revert the buff, are we all still going to play Petty Officer? We sort of wrote it off in the first place because it's a 3-mana 3/1. What are you talking about? That's nearly unplayable. I feel like I almost would have rather seen it go to a 2/2, but there are so many 2/2s in Bilgewater already that I definitely understand not wanting to go for something like that. Maybe even a 2/3 I wouldn't have been mad at, just to take a little bit of the aggressive power off of him. Because Nab and Pirate Aggro really play like aggro decks for the first 5 or so turns and then sort of stabilize out until, at least for Noxus Nab, you just kind of sit there from, turns 6 and 7 trying to wait for that Riptide Rex turn. But you can definitely aggro out the early game, and we've even seen TF Swain do it. It's where it has such a widespread of good matchups, is that they have this switch that they can sort of flick in the early game and go, okay, you know what? I open Petty Officer, we're putting our foot on the gas, we're going full smork. And I think going down to a 3/1, you're going to see it fall out of Noxus Nab. I'm unsure about TF Swain and Pirate Aggro, as I think the additional 1-drop in Pirate Aggro is something they really like. But overall, I do think this could be the quality of life change that really pushes Bilgewater down in the playability. I believe these are the only 2 Bilgewater nerfs. Because what are the other problem cards in Bilgewater? It's Petty Officer and Riptide Rex were sort of the 2 big ones that come to mind for people. So I think that putting this down to 1 HP, Rex is still Rex, but Petty Officer was a Bilgewater staple, and I'm not sure that he's going to live through this slight nerf, especially as more and more Shadow Isle decks main deck 3 Vile Feast as well as 3 Unspeakable Horror. Being able to just kill a 3-drop like that got questionable value depending on what actually popped out of that random 1-drop slot, or if you got the keg. I really think this could be a sharp decline for Bilgewater in the tournament scene. We're not even going to talk about Cosmic Inspiration. I have no idea why this card ever gave you your spell mana back, so I think that this was a necessary change. We're just kind of going to gloss over that one. And instead, we're going to talk about Bastion. So So Targon Lee Sin is a deck that's been popping up a lot in the tournament scene lately, and I think the +1/+1 buff on Bastion is actually massive for a deck like that. We could even see, you know, less denies coming out of the deck because they are pretty much across the board playing 3 deny and no Bastion at this point. We've seen a couple of them play 1 Bastion, and I think that's really the only deck we've seen play Bastion in the tournament format. So Flash Freeze has come up pretty recently as an adaptation out of a lot of War Mothers and Freljord decks in general to deal with both Atrocity and Lee Sin. So if you have to proactively Flash Freeze a Lee Sin to not die, and then I get to play a Bastion onto it, now I'm getting the tempo of still kicking the unit back to your hand because I have 1 attack point, and that spell shield is going to be nearly impossible for you to pop since you did just already commit your Frostbite spell. You would now have to have sort of a dinky throwaway spell like a Vile Feast or an Unspeakable Horror to pop the spell shield, and then another impactful spell like Vengeance or another copy of Flash Freeze in order to actually take care of my Lee Sin and stop it from kicking your unit back to your hand. And I don't know if you've run the numbers, but if you Flash Freeze my Lee Sin and then need to Vile Feast Vengeance it, that is 12 mana. So that's not something that's coming out that early, and with Lee Sin only being 4 mana, it's not super unreasonable for me to level him by turn 6 or 7. There's a very good chance that you just do not have the mana for an answer to a Bastion that comes out after a Flash Freeze. I think that's where the +1/+1 buff is going to come in most often, but this does still sort of represent 2 damage onto a Lee Sin that has Overwhelm, and that could be sort of the proactive spell that I play for the turn to turn on the Challenger. Oh look, not only am I representing 2 more damage, but now I have the spell shield as well. I think that Lee Sin decks are going to be absolutely insane in tournaments now. We're not seeing any buffs or nerfs onto Shenfiora. I know a couple people were thinking maybe Genevieve gets hit, so I don't know that it's going to become the most popular Ionia deck, especially with the nerfs to Targon Demacia that we saw a little bit earlier on in the patch notes with Asel and Radiant Guardian, but I do think that Lee Sin is very, very well poised into the meta, which is sort of the spot that he was already filling. He just was good against the decks that we were seeing, and now with this Bastion change, I think that it's going to definitely overtake Shenfiora in terms of Ionia playability, especially with the Asel nerf. Like, this is now where I want to be committing my Targon. Asel is no longer an appealing enough option to keep me off of Lee Sin, and I definitely think we're going to see a lot of Asel decks fall to the wayside, not only because of the nerf to Radiant Guardian, but because of the buff to the Lee Sin decks through Bastion. Grandfather Rumel I thought was going to be cool for a second, just because I was sort of thinking, what does it look like if I just throw every spell shield unit in a deck? And the answer turned out to be not very good, since it's literally just Rumel infused Firebrand. I mean, Fledgling Stellacorn, unless I'm like playing an insane amount of buff stuff, this isn't doing anything. Giddy Sparkologist, you can respond to the spell shield, so it's really just Rumel and Firebrand, and of course Asel when we talk about main deckable spell shield units. So I don't think this does anything. I was kind of theorizing, oh, it would be really cool, like how does a control deck actually deal with that? And the answer was there's just not enough spell shield units for it to matter. But maybe he actually does start coming out in something like a Ramsel deck. I was talking about how you sort of need 2 infinite Mind Splitters to level them, but Rumel giving your other units more survivability could be, sort of what you needed. So we'll have to see. I think that there actually is space for Rumel to become a little bit more relevant, maybe as like a one-of in some of the Asel decks, but overall, I'm not even confident in that statement, and I think it's more likely that just nothing happens with Rumel. His playability isn't really his weakness, it's more so his own health, so we'll see. And of course, Hush got its cost increase that they had mentioned in patch 1.10. This is sort of what they were looking to do with it. You can now only play 3 Hush in a turn as opposed to 4, but I mean, honestly, I really wasn't hushing 3 times in a turn that often. The second one is really what matters. I mean, hushing twice is very reasonable. That one did happen a lot, but unless you were an Ezreal deck or a Lux deck, you generally weren't firing this off 4 times. I think this absolutely kills Targon Ezreal, which I don't think really was a thing ever to begin with anyway. I mean, like, it was a thing, people played it, but I wasn't impressed by the deck then, and then of course Ezreal got nerfed, so we'll just kind of move on from that one. I think the 1.12 change where they reduced the cost maybe down to 2 and it's non-repeatable, I think that's what people are really looking for. I think that's what I'm looking for out of this card, just because I mean, it really only takes 2 Hush for the card to get full value, so upping the mana cost by 1 on that, I don't think it's enough, and because Targon Lee Sin is going to be so popular, I think that this is still just going to be a card that sees a lot of play. I'm curious to see what the 1.12 version looks like, but honestly, I'm ready to move on from this because I don't feel like I have a lot to say about this change, especially if it's going to be changing in 2 weeks, so it's kind of in a weird spot design-wise for the next 2 weeks, and we're just going to kind of have to sit on that. It feels weird. And then finally, we got Mountain Goat. I think that they're really trying to push Taric decks, and I think they had mentioned Taric specifically in their Bastion buff, so I don't know. Maybe this is it. I know Nola Gold had been screwing around with some kind of Braum gem deck that he never ended up taking into tournaments, and I think that any Taric deck that you're going to be playing is nowhere near as good as a Lee Sin deck, so I don't think this does anything for the tournament meta specifically, and that's just what it is. That's sort of the main difference between tournaments and ladder. If you're ever wondering, like, oh, why does this matter for tournaments and not for ladder? It's because certain regional combinations are hard to justify in tournament. Because we're playing so many region-locked tournaments, you know, if you're playing, let's say, Targon Freljord for this Taric gem deck, and, like, it's pretty good or, like, even really good, you took, like, Lee Sin and War Mothers off the table for yourself. And taking two very powerful decks off the table to, you know, make one very powerful deck, especially if you're playing in a format with bans where it could just get banned out, you know, it feels like you're really shooting yourself in the foot for nothing. So that's sort of the main difference between tournaments and ladder when we talk about cards like this and why they don't fit into one space and doing the other, because you can play Targon Freljord on ladder, that's absolutely fine, but in tournaments it's going to hurt you a little bit more. So that is the end of patch 1.11. The highlights are we're thinking Lee Sin is going to become really big. There are no nerfs to War Mothers. I feel like we've gone through a couple of metas where Shadow Isle feels like either the Atrocity or the Harrowing region, and usually it's the Atrocity region, so we'll see how that one ends up shaping up. I think that if they are going to nerf Atrocity in the future, it's most likely that it goes up to 7 mana to prevent things like double Atrocity in a turn, which is a play that we're actually seeing fairly commonly out of War Mothers right now, which makes the deck feel so bad to play against, where they just get to, you know, throw 2 Tryndamirs at you, and they can even throw the same Tryndamir at you twice if it hasn't leveled yet, so it's really not something that I like seeing. I think if they do end up pushing Atrocity up to 7 mana, you have to give Endure Spiders back there 6 mana Endure, because I think you do need to be able to play Endure Atrocity in the same turn in order for that deck to live. And it would be interesting, you know, Endure is falling off. I really wouldn't mind swapping the mana costs on Atrocity and Endure right now, I think. But that's not a statement I'm totally confident on. I didn't love watching Endure Spiders play, so we'll see how it is. Anyway, matchup breakdowns pretty much for the rest of the week. Not going to do any Lee Sin just because we're grabbing tournament footage, so I'm going to be grabbing stuff from the old patch. So I want to focus on decks that didn't get hit, like Shen Fiora, War Mothers, things where not a whole lot changed, so, but things that'll still be relevant in the tournament space. We're going to have to wait until next week for me to get into Lee Sin decks so that I have tournament footage from the upcoming weekend while the Bastion buff is in effect, and we get to see a lot more Lee Sin. So that's kind of what we're looking at over the next couple of weeks content-wise. Thank you guys so much for watching. My name is Boulevard, and as always, good luck in your tournaments.